So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and get started because I want to maximize our time with our panelists. Okay. All right. So welcome, folks. So my name is Dr. Alfonso Ferguson. I am a member of the CSJ Research Committee as a co-chair. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of New York, New Jersey, as well as Florida. And this is a topic that's very personal to me, very near and dear to my heart. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation with colleagues and friends. And y'all just get to be a part of that. So today we're talking about LGBTQ plus counselor educators and how they're using their platforms to decolonize research within the academy. So before we actually jump in and have our presenters introduce themselves, what we will start by doing is a little bit of housekeeping. Nothing too major. If you've done one of these CSJ webinars before, it's all kind of the same thing. And so one of the things I want you guys to keep in mind of is keeping yourself on mute, right? For folks who are just attending the webinar, you can have your cameras on or off. That is your prerogative. I like to see y'all face, so I want to see y'all face. But if you're not in a space to show your face, that's okay, girl. No face, no case. Secondly, questions are welcome throughout. Feel free to put them in the chat. Our participants or our speakers will do their best to answer your questions at the end. I have a few folks here supporting, so they'll compile your questions and we'll be sure, do our best at least, to get to everyone. At the end, we will also provide the email contact for our presenters. So if you have questions specifically for one person and you don't want to share it here, or you didn't think of it till later, you can absolutely reach out to them at your earliest convenience. Lastly, for attending, you will be able to earn, or you will have the opportunity to earn at least one CEU, or one CEU, not at least, just one. And by doing that, you will have to complete the survey, which will be provided to you guys within the last 5 or so minutes of the webinar. So be on the lookout for that, and that will be placed in the chat. Again, welcome. I'm excited to see you all. And I think we're in a treat, we're in a real treat for a robust conversation, I'll say. Words are not very good for me today, but we're gonna make it do what it do. What I will do now is give folks an opportunity to introduce themselves. We have 3 amazing panelists here. So let's start with you, Dr. Hunter.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamika Hunter, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, PhD in counselor education and practice, NCC and CRC. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'll keep my introduction short because I know we have limited time. I am an intersectional research scholar. I'm in a tenure track role at Palo Alto University. Thank you again for having me.
Love it. Thank you so much. How about you, Dr. Flores?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Carlos Flores. I'm currently an associate director in the Office of Career Services at New York University. And I recently graduated with my PhD in counseling from Montclair State University. So any of our MSU folks on the call, shout out to all of you. So my dissertation research really focused on the intersection of Latinx and LGBTQ plus identity, more specifically focusing on the experiences of individuals who have experienced rejection from their family of origin and become part of a chosen family. So very excited to get to talk a little bit more about the work that I've been doing and lessons learned throughout my dissertation process with all of you today. Thank you.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Smith.
Hey folks, Dr. Flores, yeah, I'm here for the lessons because there's going to be a lot of those told. Folks, I'm core faculty at the Northwestern Counseling Master's Program. I'm also the PI for the Queer BIPOC Needs Lab here, where we are interested in adapting needs assessments through an intersectional lens for queer folks and communities and trying to explore what that means in terms of what they would like to see in support groups. And I'm also newly appointed reviewer for SAGE, Journal of LGBTQ Issues in Counseling. And yeah, I'm just on here all about queer BIPOC wellness, folks. So we're gonna get into it. So
Let's
thank you
get
for having me.
into it. I love it. I love it. Let's get into it. Um, so I'm going to jump in because I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. And I know y'all got a lot to say. As Dr. Smith shared, he's looking to learn some things. There will be lessons, there will be blessings, there will be gems, there will be seeds. But let's get into it. So one of my first questions for the panel is, as an LGBTQ plus researcher, what has motivated you to become a counseling researcher, and what contributed to the development of the identity?
I'll start. So my identity is as a queer, Black, cisgender woman with a lifelong physical disability, and certainly that influenced, my career trajectory. And being in counseling, my master's is in rehab counseling. um, I have a critique of the field, and that critique is that sometimes in counseling, counselor education, we have this propensity to engage in what I call disparity porn. And I use the word porn intentionally, because I think that there's a lack of balance in the literature and in practice, because we know what the disparities are, right? And that gives us useful information. But what I feel like we're missing, or we need more of, is understanding the strengths inherent in all communities, including marginalized and multiply marginalized communities. And I want to use that richness of those stories to enhance my teaching, my research, and my service. So when I look at our communities, I look at them from a strengths-based perspective. So I do look at uh, positive psychology concepts such as resilience, even though they have some legitimate critiques, and grit and things like that, because I just feel like we can become purveyors of like disparity porn and always talking about disparities. So that's how my identity developed as a qualitative researcher.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. So I arrived at my researcher identity really through my own lived experience, growing up in an environment where being gay was not okay, and growing up in a family and in a culture where initially it wasn't receptive to me being my authentic self. And so that caused a lot of personal mental health issues for me that I had to deal with on my own when I went off to college as an undergrad. And I remember walking out of my counselor's office. It was the first time I ever went to counseling. And I walked out of that last session telling my counselor, I want to go out and do what you do and help other people like me. That's really where the fire was lit for me to go into counseling in general. And as I went through my master's program and learned about these theories, read about this research, I constantly felt like people like me were not represented in these conversations, right? In these mainstream research studies that we cite in our textbooks and that we highly value in our field. So one of my goals going into a PhD program was to develop as a researcher to bring increased awareness and amplify the voices of people like me and my community, to make sure that there was a lens and a focus on our unique experiences, so that when another Carlos walks into a counseling office, that counselor is prepared to be able to provide truly culturally competent services to that individual. And so that's how I arrived to my research identity, which I will admit is fairly new. I'm so excited to share a little bit more about what that experience has been like, stepping newly into this researcher role and really working on owning that as another part of my identity.
Yeah, I love how, like, right, it seems like we're central kind of talking about the needs for representation. For me, it certainly was, just acknowledging and feeling that, like communities that I'm a part of, that we're not that our experiences are monolithic, right? Like we're not going to all be the same, and needing to go ahead and explore that. And so, folks, I come from a lineage of storytellers. And so as a qualitative researcher, that just feels super aligned um, with that attachment there. And I also had a spirit of dissent. And so when we look at kind of, the messages that were that are sent about specifically queer BIPOC folks in literature that there, and even in the services that are provided, it engages in a lot of identity fragmentation. And so I was wanting to make sure that like there's some diversity within this group, because we're not all alike, right? And so what are those needs was definitely right, a goal to go ahead and be a part of research. And so, and of course there were mentors too. I think that, you know, in my graduate work, that showed me how more and more I was impacted by research, because I was, you know, I was thinking that quantitative was dominating, right, the field. And when, you know, they shared that with me, let me tell y'all, the concepts of central tendency told me up, y'all. That bell curve, when I look at, you know, when you look at those lessons, like I started to become really, really, really curious about those variants or those individuals that were omitted from research, right? Right, and so ever since then, I knew that you know, I needed to be a part of research and provide this sense of diversity within this group that's so rich.
Thank you all so much. I'm really sitting here with a little bit of what each of you have shared. Not only like approaching research from a strength-based model, or even like wanting to be the representation, or even wanting to continue on like a legacy of storytelling and the importance of capturing stories from multiply marginalized communities, right? I'm really sitting with, it's a little early, but I am on fire a little bit already. I'm really sitting with the importance and the need. And although we're all motivated to get into research in different ways, in different capacities, there's an intentionality in wanting to create spaces for people who look like us, sound like us, have similar backgrounds, right? And I think up until now, or maybe we're even still in transition, right? There has been, or there used to has been, because it still is, this very westernized approach to research. This very, I'm going to go in, I'm going to get what I need, and I'm out. And so I'm actually curious to hear from you all, how, if at all, does your research working with the LGBTQ plus community inform your clinical practice, inform your supervision, informing your teaching style or pedagogy? What are you guys thinking and feeling
For me, it informs everything. So my teaching, my clinical practice, supervision, everything, and my even my approach to research. In 2020, I did a study because all of my work is intersectional. So it has it's marginalized communities, but that have one or two or more marginalized identities. And I did a study in 2020, queering disability, where participants, they talked about this theme, punishment, that came out from the study. And basically what that meant was that, you know, people with disabilities who are also a sexual or gender minoritized person, we can't just assume that coming out is the be all end all, right? If you are a BIPOC, queer identified person with a disability, then you run the risk of losing that familial structure where you can help fight racism, for example. And you might have to engage in survival sex and things like that. So coming out is really a Western white phenomenon that everybody just has to come out, right? And it also doesn't recognize if you are a queer identified person with a chronic illness or disability that requires support for your activities of daily living, that you might not. I had one participant who basically the parents said that if they continued in this same-sex relationship, that they would be essentially put out of their home. And they were totally, because the condition was a degenerative one, they were no longer able to work. They needed support, like personal care needs and things like that. It became a choice between surviving and thriving in this relationship they were happy with. So I think that it's really important, out of that research, working with clients, I recognize that the intersections of identity might mean that coming out cannot, and maybe in some cases should not be the goal, just because it can call into question your psychological and physical safety. So it informs everything that I do.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Hunter. I will say I'm sitting with what you shared in when it comes to intersectionality and like coming out. Yes, I understand and I agree. Like it's a very westernized approach to like self-disclosure, right? This idea of coming out, but like the multi-layered challenge to coming out when you have multiply marginalized identities.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. What about others?
Yeah, I would say for me, one of the biggest influences is on my teaching in terms of recognizing that although I identify as part of the community, I can't be the voice and represent the entire community and the diversity within it. So one of the things I prioritize is making sure I'm inviting speakers from the community, a diverse set across the spectrum, to share what their lived experience is like directly with students. So, through my research, I do also qualitative research and interviewing folks, even folks that look like me and sound like me and might have similar life experience as me. I always learn something new about how their journey was different than mine. So I always have to guard against my own assumptions, being part of the community itself, and recognize that I also need to pull in voices from other areas of the community into my classes so students can hear the true diversity of stories that exist in our community.
And for me, it informs my work because it charges me to be curious about how my clients and students are impacted systemically, culturally, and by a sense of rules of functioning, right? I think that when we kind of address where a person is in their interactions with different systems, right? You get to get a sense of what they have access to. And so what I've learned in a lot of my research is that sometimes having, depending on what you have access to, schematically, it kind of translates to worth over time, right? And what a person has permission to do and how to function in the world. And so I love to kind of explore that context of where a person is in those systems and what culture they're coming from, because then they get to identify how there were aspects of strength and protection in maybe some of those moments and experiences. But then they get to go ahead and choose what hasn't been helpful for them. And so just as a tangible example, I remember one of the themes that came up. So when my early research, lived experience of gay Black men in the Black church through the lens of intra-racism and toxic masculinity. So through those themes of intra-racism, we were seeing that there were individuals that were interpreting their community, I'll say maybe aggressive redirection in their gender expression, came up in focus groups was actually a form of protection from white supremacy, right? And being harmed in a larger, right, sense, right? But still very problematic, right? So there were parts of that were very problematic to, them feeling whole, right? And so, through that processing in those systems, these brothers were able to go ahead and kind of make sense of, right, like why they were receiving these messages and how they were going to continue to hold it moving forward, right? So that's just an example. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Smith and Dr. Flores. As you all were talking, I started to process and make sense or reflect on my own research experience, right? And one of the things, so I like to say fortunate, but also very intentional in researching and working with communities that I'm a part of, because I wanted to rewrite the narrative of research within these communities, not only create a platform or a space for us to be visible in the academic sector, but also to rewrite the narrative of our relationships with research and taking ownership of that relationship with research. Again, like I mentioned earlier, not having someone come in, or this very westernized approach of come in, get what you need and go out. And then you write a paper that your participants never see, never read, never really know what's being said about them. And one of the ways in which I've kind of like answered this question and been intentional in connecting my work and research to my practice, supervision, or even teaching, it's bringing it into the room. There are times where I'll be working with clients, and so I've recently done some work around relationship resiliency within Black gay male relationships, intimate relationships. And what I've done is, I would bring it in and I'd say, I'm doing this study and findings have been looking like this, and I'll kind of have conversations with my clients. Does this make sense for you? Are you seeing that? Or you said something that made me think of this thing that I recently researched, and some of the findings were this. And I think in doing that, there's like a feeling of being seen and acknowledged, but also sometimes even put in language to something that clients can't completely describe. Similarly, in supervision and teaching, it's really bringing this awareness like, hey, there's actually these intersectional communities, and I'm giving you this one example, but if we're looking at it through a very intersectional lens, or there's a larger thing at play that you want to be mindful of when working with your clients or even teaching a course like this. So it's really this very social justice or even multicultural focus approach to teaching and supervision. But thank y'all for that. I'm actually curious as we jump in, what tools do you all employ to combat white supremacy in academia while navigating your own intersecting identities? And I feel like we've all kind of been talking around the white supremacy and how we actually are intentionally combating it, but I don't know if we've kind of like gone directly into it. Dr. Smith, how about you start us off? She looked ready.
Well, so one of my students had mentioned, wonderful mentor, if you out there and you see this recording, brother, I appreciate you. Young mentee, Dwayne Gelly, in the online, taught them in the online program. And they mentioned how we just have to be careful of how like cultural pluralism could be, a huge issue in the work that we do if we don't acknowledge the dominant culture at play, right, and how it's been filtered through, what in our day-to-day interactions and with individuals within research. So I think that's definitely been something that, right, that I feel like that I try to do with my research assistants, and then in terms of some other tools that we go ahead and implement in terms of decolonizing certain methodologies and analysis methods and stuff like that for our research, to ensure that we're not repackaging, right, this white lens, within research and how we engage folks, and really just challenging the legitimatization, right, of the knowledge of who's the holder of knowledge, right, in that space, right. So those are some things that kind of come up to me initially.
I just want to say, I'm sorry to cut you off, Dr. Hunter. I just want to say there's something you said, Dr. Smith, that really hit me in a particular way, and I haven't quite I don't know how to describe it because I'm still processing it. It's the repackaging, essentially, of what I took from it of like white supremacy, right? The ways in which we are coloring or shading it in a way that feels palatable to us, but it's still the same thing. And to what extent we're like perpetuating this narrative or this message rather than challenging and creating equity for all. At least that's what I took from what you said. But the word repackaging really stung in a way that I'm still trying to make sense of.
Yeah, that was really impactful. What I was going to say is, you're right. That's one of the things we kind of have to fight against. And one of the ways I do it in my research is that, a lot of times we do these majority to minoritized comparisons. Well, inherent in that, we're always going to be in the minority if we set it up that way, right? The majority becomes or stays the frame. It's the standard, right? So in looking, because I'm endemic to my research, and I hold these positionalities, I want to understand, as someone said earlier, we're not a monolith, right? So I do comparisons within the community. So different identities of people who are queer identified, but queer identified with disability, or racial and ethnic minoritized groups that are LGBTQ, like what the differences are, rather than comparing the majority group to the minoritized group, because that inherently is a deficit model. If we do that each time, if we compare the differences among our community, then we can deepen our understanding of the community and the differences that exist.
Yeah, I want to echo what Dr. Smith and Dr. Hunter have been saying. I want to piggyback off the idea of challenging the notion of who's the expert in the room, right? And so through my research, I make it a priority to, directly tell my participants, like, you're the expert here, right? I'm here to learn from you. And also in every step of that process, including the writing and distribution of results and findings, it's always centering those participants as the experts of their own stories, right? It's not me coming in as a researcher and saying, this is my story, right? I'm just here to facilitate that narrative. So that's one thing, right, that I prioritize in research. And then another thing that I want to add is not losing sight of the importance of self-care and collective care as resistance. I think a lot of times, especially in academia and academic spaces, us folks of color and people of marginalized identities are the ones that people turn to do this work all the time. And that can be exhausting and tiring when we're dealing with our own oppression at the same time. So I try to, as much as possible, protect my own wellness and mental well-being as a form of resistance, because I know that, especially in social justice work and this type of work, it can feel overwhelming to feel like we have to do more and more and more. But actually taking care of ourselves is also important, if not more important, to having a more sustained engagement in the work and avoiding that burnout that too often happens.
I'm seeing a lot of head nods, y'all. Go ahead, Dr. Hunter.
Oh no, I was just agreeing with everything he said. Everything. Oh.
Absolutely. I find that, or I believe that, or I observe that all of us were really sitting with self-care as an act of resistance. And I think there's this cultural norm that you're speaking of, Dr. Flores, where we get into these positions and we're expected to perform at a certain level and do more. And we want to do more because we're often one of few in our departments, at our universities, et cetera. So we want to do more, but then the weight of doing more can be overwhelming, and it often doesn't allow space for us to prioritize our well-being. I'll speak for myself, but I've had experiences where it's like, oh no, if I don't do it, it's not going to get done. So I need to do it. So I need to stretch myself really, really, really thin as possible, because I'm needed, or the people need me, or the student needs me, or whatever. So prioritizing my own well-being up until now, or recently, wasn't always a priority.
Right. And just to add and echo everything that things that other folks have said, is that, I really feel like that comes from that, again, that access and permission and worth, right? And so that, I challenge myself to go beyond the feeling that I'm not enough and that I didn't do enough in the day, right? Whether it's for myself or for my community, right, or for my students, right? Yeah, that it is difficult. So that is definitely a part of that agenda.
Absolutely. I'm curious to hear from you all. I'm wondering, what strategies do you utilize to even create solidarity within the communities you research? I was going to go into examples. I'm like, that was clear. Y'all get it.
Yeah.
So what? Go ahead.
I think it's important. Well, first of all, it's important to be a part of the community, right? So if you're a part of the community, so it's not this extractive thing where you're just coming in, getting what you need and leaving the community. So it's really important to understand the needs of the community, to be a part of the community, not just when you're doing research, but be a part of it. People know who you are, they trust you. And you can grow in that relationship, recognizing that those communities are the experts, as was said earlier. But I think the first and foremost, we need to actually be a part of those communities that are doing the work, not necessarily the ones with the biggest flash, but the ones that are, grassroots, really understanding what communities want and need.
Yeah, I'd like to build off of Dr. Hunter here. It takes a certain level of vulnerability, I found, to put ourselves out there when we're doing research with our own community. Initially maybe I naively thought, oh, I'm part of the community, and I just say that and people will want to talk to me, right? But that wasn't enough, right? It's actually being able to share your story and be vulnerable in the same way that you're asking your participants to be vulnerable. And for me, throughout my dissertation research, I was used to being in that vulnerable place as a counselor, as an educator in the classroom on panels like this, but never had I had that experience as a researcher, and I was trained, as many of us are trained, in these mainstream Western views of what a researcher should look like. And I had that conflicting with, right, being vulnerable and sharing my story. So I had to find my own way through that to say, okay, I'm not going to be that stereotypical image of a researcher that's prioritized in our education, in our textbooks, right? I'm going to share my authentic self fully as well, right? And that's still a valid form of research, and I'm still a valid researcher when I'm doing that. So that was something that that was really driven home for me doing my dissertation research recently.
Yeah. So for all my new research assistants, and even just past encouragements from old research and from mentors, encourage me to just be very clear, kind of like this transparency that we're talking about, to be very clear in our positionality, right? Clear amongst ourselves as a team, why we're doing this work, what draws us to this work. In addition to, can we even share that with folks that we're going to go ahead and see in community? That's definitely one of the questions that I ask all my research assistants, when they're wanting to be a part of the lab. What brings you to this work? Why queer BIPOC people? What from your lived experience, right, brought you to this work? And can you speak on that? And so having a level of transparency into commune, right? Amongst the people that you're going to go ahead and be with and exploring with is really important in doing that work versus kind of having this distance, cold, observer, right, expert lens, right? So we do a lot of that. And I guess one other particular tool that really sticks out to me is using member checks in terms of highlighting voices of our participants. And so we know that, like, decolonizing literature, it encourages us to go ahead and engage in land acknowledgements. And I was just like, well, look at that. You basically just told me to make sure I acknowledge the land and basically the voices, right? Of the people that are coming through, this particular study. And so we try to make sure that, like, when we are creating qualitative data, we decolonize, for instance, consensual qualitative methods for analysis. And instead of coming up with core ideas and themes amongst the research team, we're trying to make sure that, again, after our interviews, that, like, hey, we check back in with the participants to see if we got it right, to see if we got those themes right, from the beginning to the end. So those are definitely, in engaging in those land acknowledgements, those are definitely some things that we try to engage in just to start.
I love that, Dr. Smith. And so it made me think of a couple of things, and I want to share a little bit about my own experience as it pertains to research and like being in community with the communities that I'm doing research and work with, right? Not of or for, but with, because I do find that it's collaborative, and that approach kind of also makes the world a difference. So I was recently working on a study where I may have shared this earlier, but investigating what contributes to relationship resiliency and longevity in Black SGL male couples. And so I started to dig a little bit deeper, and I wanted to investigate that same experience with an older Black gay male couple, couples that have been together for over 20 years or older. And a part of it was really to, again, rewrite or challenge the narrative, the social narrative of what Black gay male relationships look like, romantic relationships look like, and then the challenge that counter narrative of same gender loving relationships don't last, right? And so like showing like there's actually evidence. I have couples that have been together for 50 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, etc. And a way in which I did this study was very different from how I've done other studies. And it made me realize to what extent my westernized training had conditioned me in limiting the connection that I have with my participants. Right. So with this study, I actually went into the community because when we're investigating with older couples or older individuals, there's some resistance to doing it online, or there's some resistance to talking about their personal businesses with someone they don't know. Right. And so a lot of the couples that I did connect with, they were like, come to the house, let's have dinner and we'll do the interview. Right. And so that it was very different than what I had envisioned or how I've done research prior, but it was very impactful. It was very necessary, right? Because within this population, they're very protective of their information, of their experiences. So they wanted to be in a space where they had control over the environment and to whatever extent be able to control what they were able to give or not give. And I love that you brought up, Dr. Smith, like member checking, because that is absolutely an important piece of my interview process and protocol. So member check-in also solidified that, again, that relationship, that making sure that they're being heard or I'm listening clearly or accurately. But I find that with this one, like going into the home really allowed a level of comfort and confidence in them sharing their stories that made the world a difference. It also made me feel very protective of them, very protective of them, and wanting to make sure that not only am I telling their stories accurately, but I'm protecting their stories in the ways that they would protect their stories. And I don't know if traditional westernized approach to research like lends that aspect of like support or even protection of the stories or narrative or information that our participants are sharing. So I know we have a few minutes left, so we may be able to squeeze in 2 questions, but we'll definitely go into one more question. And so my next question reads, what tools do you employ? No, I already asked that. What advice would you give to scholars who are looking to conduct research with the LGBTQ plus community? Like, what are some of the do's and don'ts of working with queer community members, or even, because we've all kind of named it as such, intersecting marginalized communities?
Sorry about that little, I don't know, my internet just went out for a quick second, but I'm back and better than ever. No, just kidding. But we have to kind of examine our own thoughts, right? Like, in terms of epistemology, like who gets to create knowledge, right? Who are the keepers of knowledge, and challenging that. And moving away from just having, people with marginalized identities talked about in a single multicultural course, right? And so thinking about like, are we doing the same thing, right? Like you said, repackaging the same thing. And then when we're looking at axiology, like the morals and values, what are you using as you're researching? And are those morals and values reflected in the community that you're working with and researching, rather than overlaying, white supremacist ideology about what's professional onto communities, right? Or what morals and values those communities are supposed to have. And then, if you're looking at it from a ontological standpoint, are you humanizing your research participants? And they are human, right? So is that reflected in what you are putting out there, the way that you're writing them up? And are you comfortable when what you thought was going to be the answer to your research question might be different? And are you comfortable with writing that up as it occurred? Because that's the ethical way of doing it. So sometimes we might go in with a preconceived notion about what the answer to a particular research question is, but our experiences in the study and with the participants might prove differently, and you have to be, function in integrity and report that as it is, even if it's contrary to what you initially believed. I think those are some of the just quick do's and don'ts I would suggest.
You want me to go, Dr. Flores? So for me, some do's I would say, so definitely do some exploration and everything in terms of like how, and be creative in terms of like how you engage in funding for your research, because in going in community, I realize that there's a lot of distrust and everything in terms of who you receive your funding from. And so I think that, what I'm understanding now is that there should be a mix of what I'm hearing so far. And I'm kind of unpacking this in real time with my research assistants, in addition to with the rest of the other counselors, social justice warriors, and everything attending this webinar. Is what is more appropriate way of funding? Because I think of sustainability and these programs and resources continually to be in communities. However, in going into some of these communities, I think that there's definitely a desire for there to be more in-house funding, and making sure that if there is external funding, that the autonomy is fully within the community on how they want to go ahead and spend that money from the get-go. Because I think that there's this kind of perception that once there's funding, that there can be anything done outside of what they actually want within the program. And so there should be a lot of discussion about that, right? And bridging the gap, I think, right? And having some creativity with that. Lastly, I think the only other thing that came up with that to not do is to avoid, it's kind of came up earlier, is to avoid feeling as though that if you are a part of the community, that you don't have any implicit bias to be able to work through.
Exactly.
Right. So for example, okay, I got an amen. All right. Right.
Yes.
Right. Right. So it's right for myself. I had to realize with my little research assistants, even though I identify with a part of the community, the queer BIPOC community, that doesn't mean I'm going to be able to have access, right, to them. And so we have to make sure that we slow down and again develop those and trusting relationships and increase our trustworthiness within community. So those are some things that kind of came up. I was a little stumped on the don'ts, but yes, good question though.
Yeah, I would just echo that piece about doing the work on ourselves, right? And sort of unpacking our own thoughts and beliefs and assumptions always, right? Even if we're working with folks who are part of our own communities, and leaning on other people to be those critical friends to hold us accountable, right? And to give us outside perspective, both within our community and even people outside of our community, right? To get a well-rounded perspective of how we're looking at it through our lens, right? And sort of don't go it alone, go at it with other folks who you trust to go along that journey with you.
I agree. And I would just add that, we do have to be careful about over-identification, right? So that because we have some shared experiences with our participants, we don't want to assume we know their whole story, because it could be different from ours, right? And so we need to be careful about that and still be curious, like we would with any other group of participants, rather than assuming that we know their story because we have shared identities.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I have a minute to squeeze in one quick question for you all. Do you have any recommendations for students who are interested but hesitant in engaging in counseling research? What advice would you give them?
Well, I
Go and
think any
do it
research
anyway.
that you do, oh, go ahead. Yeah, they're right. Do it anyway. Do it anyway. It just needs to be something you're passionate about, right? Because this is difficult and it takes a long time, and it's a lot of, you don't necessarily recognize right off the personal impact it has because you're looking at a population that you also are a member of. So there's a lot to unpack a lot of times when you're hearing the stories. So I think, let it be passionate. You be passionate about what subject that you're interested in looking into, because it's a long haul to do this work in a culturally responsive way.
That part. Go ahead, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, I was just going to echo and say, just connect yourself to mentors or people that have similar interests. In undergrad, I didn't necessarily have that amount of support to kind of catapult me into getting in research, but grad school is where it really took off. So you might be more connected to individuals, your graduate work. Go to ACA, go to your prospective state conferences. You're going to find those individuals. They are doing that work for sure to kind of give you that guidance. You don't want to do it in isolation for sure.
No.
Yeah, I would say, don't be intimidated. I know for me, I didn't come from a research background necessarily. I didn't really engage in research until my doc program. So for me, it was really reminding myself of the why. Why do I want to do research? What's the impact I want to have in my community that I can have in a different way through research than maybe I've had through counseling or teaching or supervising, and grounding myself in that mission and in that why. So in those moments when it feels challenging or you're not sure how to move forward, you're grounded in that why. And I would also say, just as we've been talking a lot today about trusting our participants with, or letting our participants know that they're the experts, right? And they have knowledge to contribute. All of us have knowledge to contribute, right? Not just academics, not just faculty members. We all have our own lived experiences and we have the capacity to contribute to knowledge creation. So I would lean into your own power that you have, just as you are.
Come on, leaning into the power that you have within. Let's go.
I got to put that on a shirt.
Period. I'll buy it. So really quick, y'all, I know we have about 10 minutes left, and so I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. There's one question in the chat, and this is specifically for Dr. Smith. And so Myra is shared, Dr. Smith, how do you make the call about whether or not you can share elements of your positionality and motivation for the research with participants without skewing your data? And it's two parts. And she says, or do you hold the risk of skewing the data is inherent in any research process, whether or not positionality is made transparent?
Well, I think acknowledging that we hold some level of power when we sit in front of a client, immediately or ask someone if they want to go ahead and give their time to participate in a study, that is going to impact or skew. So maybe I'm answering that question, right? Like that's going to go ahead and skew some level of confirmation bias to some degree, right? But we also have to remember that people do have their own autonomy, and we have to not take ourselves so seriously, and that we have that much impact. I think that after establishing that relationship with individuals, right, you kind of what was shared before, you realize that it does provide some level of care, right? And people want to engage in the study more, right? Once you share the reasons why you are there in the first place, right? So you get more buy-in, you get more, more individuals wanting to go ahead and also contribute to change within communities when you're sharing like why you are there. So if anything, I think that ethically, it can contribute to being change agents within communities and start, support the dissemination of bridging the gap between research getting to communities much faster, right? If you engage in that positionality and transparency with your participants, for sure. Or at least that's what I'm feeling so far. So, and that might not be everybody's experience. So, yeah.
Okay. Did anyone else on the panel want to give a shot at answering the question based on your own experiences?
I think I find that sharing first of all, I value authenticity. So I find that sharing my identities with participants helps them to understand that I'm not in there like being extractive, right? I'm a part of this community. I want to be a part of supporting the community and bringing things that are necessary or creating that call to action and supporting things that they already need. So for me, I don't feel like it skews the data. It's being transparent in both who I am and why I am there. And so I feel like it actually acts as a connector to participants so that they know I'm not someone from the outside studying these people, right? I am a part of this community. So I've found it to be facilitative for me.
Yeah, and I would add that process of sharing our positionality is also a good reminder for ourselves as researchers as we're going through the interpretation of the data, right? To make sure that we're keeping our positionality at the forefront of our mind, to avoid, skewing the data in that way, right? Towards our own natural inclinations or interpretations. So I think it can also be beneficial when it comes to interpreting the data on the researcher side.
Awesome. Myra, I don't know if that answered your question or you feel supported in regards.
It does. Thank you so much. That was a very thorough answer from all of you. Thank you.
No problem, no problem. I know we have a few more minutes, but I'm open to taking at least one more question from the audience. For any one of our participants, or panelists, I should say.
So much distance, Dr. Ferguson. We are community here.
I know, right? My apologies, y'all. My apologies. I feel like I've been asking all the questions. I shouldn't ask another one. But I guess I am curious. And what has been y'all experience with like publishing your work, especially when it comes to like focusing on marginalized minority communities?
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Were you ready to say something, Marcus?
You can go ahead.
In some ways, okay. In some ways, it's been frustrating because my work is intersectional. So usually the population has two marginalized identities. And so for example, disability, the queer and disability one is disability and sexual expansiveness. And they'll be like, oh, that we don't want to do this in the rehab journal, which is the disability one. Do want to go to the sexual orientation and gender journal and vice versa. So it's like, okay, you're not understanding. First of all, you're trying to shrink me down into one little box, and I'm trying to expand the box or get rid of the box altogether. And so it's a little bit frustrating because I've kind of gotten shifted from one journal to the next and trying to make it be a single identity. Whereas in my intersectional research, it's the understanding that being intersectional is not additive or multiplicative. It creates a whole other set of experiences that you can't parse the identities out. So that part of it is frustrating, but still I've gotten things published. And so that makes it worthwhile. Like people coming back to me, even still now, talking about studies and how that impacted them, and it was the first time that they saw themselves represented and in the literature and in practice. And so I think that makes it worthwhile. But to be completely transparent, in some ways it's frustrating because I do a lot of intersectional research.
Yeah, I'll just that resonates with me. I'll just say that like it frustrated me to go to professional a little bit. Still got love for everybody out there that I've met. But I've had some frustration in professional presentations and of course just publishing in the desire for me to disseminate knowledge in a very linear fashion, right? So kind of like that, Dr. Hunter, that box that you mentioned, I'm like, this is not step one, step two, step three, in some cases, with certain populations that you're working with. And so trying to even kind of grapple my head around my experience with communities and to put it in step one, step two, it's extremely frustrating. So yeah, that's been my experience. But we're getting the work out there though, folks.
Yes, we
I know
are.
that's right.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Dr.
Can I add very
Flores, and then
quickly,
we'll
I want to echo the idea of silos and boxes. And obviously, if you're on a tenure track faculty route, publications, manuscripts are really important. But if you're not, I encourage folks on the call to think of creative ways to get that knowledge out there to folks on the ground, right? So think about blog posts, YouTube, right? We live in a social media age. Be creative in terms of how to get this important information out there, and don't let reviewer number 2 be the reason that counselors in the field are not getting access to this information.
It's always review number 2.
Review
I don't
number
know.
Always.
And so we're pretty close to time, so I kind of want to take an opportunity to wrap and thank our presenters, our panelists. Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful for you guys being a yes to this experience.